I'm going to talk about grafting today, mostly whip grafting, which to me is the simplest way of grafting. And it's simple and it's quite effective. It's very easy to learn, less danger of cutting yourself and that sort of thing. So we're going to be grafting some apples now. I'm going to do a variety of apple called Monty's Surprise, which is a variety that I actually introduced into North America from New Zealand. Joe Robinson, in her landmark book, Eating on the Wild Side, which describes the lost nutritional quality of a lot of our fruits and vegetables. She was extolling the virtues of Monty's Surprise apple from New Zealand and wanted to find a source for them. She's been a customer of ours for years, so she wrote this book on the lost nutritional qualities in our fruits and vegetables and wanted to find the Monty's Surprise apple, the most nutritious apple in the world, and couldn't find it in North America. It turns out it was only available in New Zealand, so I contacted the people in New Zealand and I managed to get a single stick like this sent in from New Zealand, and unfortunately you had to go through the quarantine process, which is good actually, because you want to keep potential pathogens out of the country, and so it was actually spent a few years in quarantine while a virus that was in the wood was eliminated, and only then was it released to me provisionally, and I'm still not able to release it to the public, but we should be able to by next year at this time. This is the Monty's Surprise apple. Nice big apple, keeps well, you know, this is mid-March now, and it's still a good eating apple. At any rate, so what I did is I collected my Scion wood from Monty's Surprise in the dormant season. So, you know, we can still collect apples. It's still kind of cool out. We can still collect apple Scion wood, but these were collected back in January, I think, or February. And so what we did is we just cut them up into 1 foot lengths with dormant buds of last summer's growth, the sucker type growth, not from the bottom, not from the rootstock, but from the upper part of the tree. And then they were cut up into 1 foot lengths so that they would fit into this Ziploc bag that is clearly labeled. And we also put inside the bag a damp piece of paper. And if the paper starts to dry out, that means there must be a hole somewhere. And we make sure that any hole is sealed and that the bag is completely sealed with, and then it's kept in refrigeration until we graft them. So we have a whole room dedicated to storing Scion wood. And to keep it dormant, and by keeping it dormant, I can actually graft this material clear into you know, June or even July if I don't get around to it before then, and so that's really the objective, is to keep the buds nice and dormant. And you don't, when you're collecting Scion wood, you don't want spurs. The spur growth is the short side growth that extends beyond the branches, usually on 2-year wood or older, and the spurs are where flowers and fruits are produced. And we don't want flowers, we want dormant leaf buds right now. And so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to keep my Scion wood in the shade, and I'm going to make a simple whip graft. Now, you could buy an expensive, you can spend, you know, 30, 40 bucks easily on a grafting knife, but most people have a box cutter knife, and if you don't, you can get one for probably $6. And then they have this nice razor blade on them, and the razor blade is typically good for about 500 grafts, and it's nice and sharp. And so so I can make a cut between the nodes. So here's a node here and a node there and there where the buds are. So I'm cutting between the nodes, because cutting through a node is like cutting through a knot, you know, on a piece of wood. It's harder, and the diameter is a little different. So so I want to cut between the nodes, and I want to ideally make a cut on the rootstock that is the same length as the cut I made on the Scion wood. And so, and now why is this green on the Scion wood and this is red inside here? Well, that's because this particular rootstock is bud, let's see, what am I working with today? This is bud 118. So bud 118 is a semi-dwarfing rootstock for apples. And the breeders had the novel idea of using a red-leafed apple in their breeding program to select the bud 118 semi-dwarf rootstock. And the reason why they selected a red-leafed parent as one of the parents is they wanted to have it real easy for nursery workers to distinguish between a grafted portion of a newly grafted tree and the rootstock portion of a newly grafted tree. And so they in their breeding work, they selected a dwarfing rootstock called Bud 9 and a semi-dwarfing rootstock called Bud 118. And that way, when this tree is planted out now and these buds here start to grow, they will leaf out with red leaves, which makes it very clear that this is part of the rootstock. Whereas the Monty Surprise, when it starts growing from this one bud, it's going to have green leaves. So it'll be quite distinguishable. Now I could even take the time to just rub off these dormant buds right here and right now. But new ones will probably emerge several times at these nodes. And that's one of the reasons why grafts are usually made fairly close to the roots, is so that there's less rootstock to remove, because any growth from the rootstock needs to be vigorously suppressed, and all the growth energy should go through this one bud of the grafted portion, in this case Monty Surprise. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do is to just tear off a label and label this darn tree before we forget what we're working with. And a Sharpie pen here is very handy for that, and a blank tag or whatever material you have, and we can just write out Monty's Surprise in this instance, and the rootstock, which is Bud 118. Now, after we've done this, we can just put it in our bucket here. It's got a little water in it, and notice that all the time that I'm handling this, I am not touching the grafted portion. I don't want to touch that grafted portion at all, so as not to disturb the union. And so when we graft, now let me just show you. Here's a graft that we made last year. That was a simple whip graft, and you can see there is the cut that we made on the rootstock and on the Scion wood, and in this case we had two buds instead of one, so one bud was at the top and was forced to become this tree. The other bud, just hardly grew at all and turned into a little fruit spur, it looks like. So, and there's the top of the graft right there, and we used a little tree paint to keep it from drying out easily. So that's typical of what you can expect from a newly grafted tree. That is, and here's another one. Here's the graft union, and you can see where we wrapped it with the rubber. You can still see a little indentation from the rubber, and then we just left one bud on this one and just cut it off just above the bud there and painted it a little bit so it wouldn't dry out. And so now this tree is, it's got a root system that's ready for planting out at any time. And these rootstocks have been selected to root very easily. So they've been selected for size control and the ability to root easily. So and so we have in this case the Bud 118 rootstock, which is a semi-dwarf rootstock, and the Bud 9 rootstock, which is a real dwarfing rootstock, also with the red leaves. And I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but in addition to this rootstock having the red leaves, also the interior of the wood is red, and that's another way you can distinguish between the two. It's used as a rootstock. So we can just hold the two together like that. And in this case, before I do that any further, I'm going to cut it back to this one little tiny bud. Boy, that bud is so tiny, I might even go with a second bud in this instance. And but really, with one stick, I can usually get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 grafts out of a single foot of Scion wood. So we'll just hold them together like that, and then we'll take a rubber. Now this grafting rubber is actually made from the sap of the rubber tree, just like rubber tires and all that sort of thing. And the thing I like about grafting rubbers is they have a lot of strength to them, and it's a natural ingredient that biodegrades naturally, and you can get them in various sizes, but they biodegrade and fall off right about the time they need to be removed anyway. That is to say, if they're outdoors. Now, if they're indoors in a greenhouse, then that's another story. Then they usually need to be physically removed because the UV rays are largely excluded through the plastic or glass of a greenhouse, and so in a greenhouse situation, they probably need to be physically removed. And that's why when I tied off that graft, I put a half hitch behind it so that I could just pull it off easily, and the whole thing would unravel. And next graft here. Let's get another one. And so anyway, so these grafting rubbers, these particular ones that I'm using are 6 inches long by I think a 1/4 inch, and they come in various thicknesses and various lengths, and that can be useful to have for different purposes. So I think what I'd like to do is demonstrate a whip and tongue graft. And a whip and tongue graft is like the whip graft, but then you put a tongue in it to help hold it together. So in the case of the tongue, this is where a lot of people cut themselves, because you see you're having to aim the blade towards your fingers. So I guess if you're just practicing this sort of thing, it's good to probably have a leather glove on your left hand if you're afraid of the blade slipping, because you don't want to cut yourself. So I've made a tongue cut in the rootstock. Now I want to hold this and figure where I'm going to make a similar tongue cut on the Scion piece, so that the two can be wedged together, and so the whip and tongue graft is a little more precarious, and it's also a little slower to heal up, but well, that's not really true. It's sometimes with the whip and the tongue cut, it can the wood doesn't hold together quite as tightly. But the advantage is that I don't have to hold it with my thumb and forefinger. See, I can just, now that I've made a tongue cut, I can just jam it together and it stays up by itself. Whereas with the simple whip grafts, I had to physically hold it the whole time between thumb and forefinger. So now to wrap these, I'm holding the rubber behind the rootstock here, like that, with my thumb, and then pulling a little tension on it and wrapping it around itself, and just continually wrapping it around. I held it there temporarily so I could, because the rubber had started to twist up. But if I roll the rubber between thumb and forefinger, then I can avoid that twisting up like that. Now I'm going to take the rest of this rubber and tuck it under itself, and to give it a hatch hitch. That way, so if this is in a greenhouse, now if we're going to put this in a pot in a greenhouse, just like this, then to unwrap it, when the time comes to unwrap it in a couple of months, as the Scion wood grows, the rootstock and the Scion wood are going to expand this way. They're going to get thicker, and if the rubber isn't removed at some point, it could girdle the stem. The newly widening stem could get constricted by the rubber. So at that point, I'll want to just pull it from the half hitch and let the whole thing unravel. And in this case, since I did the tongue, it's not a problem, and the whole thing just holds together. And now I'll wrap it again. I'll just hold it against itself like that, pulling a little tension on it. Now, these grafting rubbers can be acquired from a grafting supply store, and I guess resell them in packages, 10 or whatever. But you can also be using electrician's tape or plastic. There's plastic wraps that you can buy that are specifically made for grafting. So there's a lot of things you can use in an emergency. but just something to hold the whole thing together. And you notice that I've covered the entire cut surface area with this rubber so that it won't dry out while it's healing together. So let's see if here's an example of a finished whip and tongue. So here you can see where the tongue cut was made and the two were inserted together. And there's the top of the Scion wood, and the one bud became this tree. So these rootstocks want to root so easily that you can see that those are actually two little roots. If this were buried deep, if this were planted to this depth, those would become roots right there. And those are called aerial roots. And some apple rootstocks, like the M111 and the M26, can be prone to these aerial roots, also known as burr knots, and that's why these particular rootstocks are not generally grafted up high. Whereas other rootstocks, like say Antonovka, which is our standard apple rootstock, I could graft them at 3 feet or 4 feet or 6 feet, you know, if I wanted to. If I had some reason to graft them high, I could. But that wouldn't work so well with these dwarfing rootstocks. Well, for one thing, you don't want to be having a dwarfing tree grafted up high just because you want to have low branches anyway. So otherwise you defeat the purpose of having a dwarfing rootstock if you let it branch out high. So another way of grafting where the rootstock is considerably thicker than your Scion piece is a modified side graft, and that's what we did in this instance here. Is we did a modified side graft. So the Scion wood was much smaller than the rootstock where we wanted to graft it. I mean, sure, we could have found a point where the Scion wood matched the rootstock maybe 2 feet up, but because this was a dwarfing rootstock that's prone to aerial roots, see, there's some right there starting to develop. So they're not going to go any further because they're going to dry out. So this was probably just a consequence of our very wet winter and spring, where it's humid for a long period of time. But and then they start to make roots. But then on a sunny day, they'll just dry out. At any rate, so what we did here was a whip and tongue graft into the rootstock, where the rootstock was much thicker than the Scion piece. So what we did is we just did a modified side graft. Basically, what we did was we, instead of matching up the diameter of the Scion to the rootstock at a low point, like I did with these grafts, since we couldn't do that in this instance, here I'll get a thicker rootstock, and I'll use a smaller piece here, so to illustrate. So let's see. So we're going to pretend that I'm going to graft it there, and this piece is quite a bit smaller. So I'll just I'll make my Scion cut, and trim it down a little bit, and then we'll make a cut on the rootstock that is approximately the diameter, ideally, of Scion cut. So just kind of shave it a little bit. You can see the redness there of the rootstock, and widen it slightly more. Okay, and then we can just grab a rubber, hold the two together. You notice that I'm not touching the cut surfaces with my fingers. I'm only cutting the bark of the rootstock, or I'm only touching the bark of the rootstock and the Scion wood, not the cut surface area. So we're going to wrap the whole darn thing. I can either put a little dab of paint there, or I can just use the grafting rubber and cover the whole thing so that nothing will dry out easily. And there we have a modified side graft, whip graft. I didn't bother with the tongue. And now I've got 3 buds there. There's a bud there, and a bud there, and a bud there. Now if I left all 3, then, you know, this might take off, and this might take off, and this might take off, and I really don't want that. It's just easier to have just 1 or 2 buds. So, and the only reason why you'd want 2 is as an emergency in case something happened to the 1 primary bud. So really you only need 1 bud. So if you're short on Scion wood, I could just cut it right there and just go with this 1 bud. So at any rate, so there's a modified side graft. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned that I want to is that whenever we're starting with new grafts, we normally want to consider cleanliness. So, you know, I have some alcohol wipes here, and so if you're switching from one variety to another, it's good to keep your material clean. So, you know, you can use an alcohol wipe to keep your blade clean and your clippers clean, and so that you're not spreading any diseases around, any viruses or anything. And and then we've got a little bit of tree paint here. Oh, it's starting to sprinkle on this. What do you know? So grafting apples can be done pretty much any time in the spring. They're not real fussy about temperature or anything. Here's some old tree paint. It's starting to dry out. Looks like I need to get some more tree paint. It's not really critical that you paint the tops of these, but if you're cutting it real close, then it's, especially if you live in a warmer climate than Western Washington, then it might be a good idea to paint them up if you're cutting the buds real close, because I could be cutting it real close with these buds. So this is just a real simple way of grafting. Some other trees have more exacting requirements. For example, a lot of the nut trees need to have higher temperature callousing requirements for a union to be successful. So I don't graft chestnuts, hazelnuts, or walnuts, for example, in the spring when the weather's so cool, unless I'm in a greenhouse or something like that, because the temperature callousing requirements are much greater. So for a union to take place between the rootstock and the Scion wood, you have to have warmer temperatures for nut trees in general, than you do for apples. So perhaps I'll do another video on grafting chestnuts a little later on in the season when I start grafting chestnuts, and so we can talk a bit about those.